Next, we're talking a lot about the climate change conference, currently being held in Dubai as we speak. So we're thrilled to bring you right now, direct from the event, Susan Gardner, Director of the Ecosystems Division at the UN Environment Program. Susan's got 3 decades of experience in international environmental policy, working for both the Mexican and the US governments. Do we have Susan?
You do have Susan.
Susan, hello. Thank you so much for joining us, coming to us all the way from Dubai. Don't want to know what time it is there, but I am very curious. What's the atmosphere look like? What are you seeing? We were just having a great panel here on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and we left that segment on the topic of the energy of youth and the difference in perspective that they have in thinking about this movement. I'm curious, what's the youth presence there? Youth activism so often drives change at these conferences.
Well, it's great to talk to you from Dubai. It is about 9 p.m. here. This is the first day. And so, you know, people like me just arrived, most of them last night, or they flew overnight. So everybody's just arriving now. But you can already feel a lot of energy. There's supposed to be about 70,000 delegates, as I understand, that will be coming here. And tomorrow in particular is when it gets really active, because that is when we'll start to see dozens of heads of states that are going to be coming for the World Climate Action Summit. And I will tell you that youth and the demands of the youth and the understanding that the youth are inheriting the problems that we leave them is one of the very, very strong messages that is on everyone's mind. They understand that this is really pivotal right now, that this COP is pivotal. The world leaders need to be talking about their ambition. I myself today spent most of my time in the UNEP pavilion. So I was largely in an area where we were talking about science. We were talking about the evidence of the problem. We know that we have made a lot of commitments, and we know that we have the solutions. And now is the time to make those shifts, because we have to do it for the next generation. And young people are getting very vocal. There's a lot of conversations about young people being more equally at the table in these negotiations, because they inherit this future.
Yeah, that's really excellent to hear. You got a little whoop from the audience here, but I don't think she's mic'd. So we had earlier today, we had from UNEP, Dr. Pushpam Kumar. I held his feet to the fire a little bit because he gave us a lot of great data, a lot of good information, but he also, a lot of it was on the bleak side of the nature and scope of the challenge. And I'm going to ask you the same thing that I asked him, to just, I know we've only got you for a very short window. I'm curious if you can let the people who are gathered with us today in the room in Washington and virtually around the world, what is the thing that makes you most hopeful for the future, what you're seeing there at COP28?
Well, there is a strong message of hope. I think what I'm hopeful about is the fact that we have the solutions. We have the data of the problem. There's going to be a number of reports coming out. In fact, this is the first global stock take. So what that means is we're looking at exactly where we are. Where are the gaps in terms of what we need to do and where we are? And this is going to be the baseline that we're going to measure ourselves and our progress moving forward. And so we're going to know, we're going to hold ourselves accountable, all of us, to making good on these promises. And we have examples of where this can be done. You know that UNEP's headquarters is in Nairobi, Kenya, and Kenya has 92% renewable energy. And this is through geothermal, hydro, solar, the whole mix. There's decisions, this conference on methane, which is not as well known as carbon in terms of a greenhouse gas, but it's enormously potent, probably responsible for about 30% of temperature rise. And there are discussions now about actually zeroing out all methane emissions from the oil industry by 2030. Something like this would be enormous. We're going to hear a lot about nature-based solutions. We're going to have one whole day on December 2nd talking about ocean. And we know the ocean is part of what is affected by climate change, but it's also part of the solution. Similarly, looking at nature more broadly, when we invest in nature restoration, we can actually restore what we have damaged, and we can actually have nature help us to both mitigate and absorb carbon, as well as vitally important adaptation and building resilience in communities so that they can better survive and persist with the various extreme weather patterns that we know are inevitable. So I'm very hopeful. As the director of the ecosystems division, I'm very hopeful about what we can do in terms of restoration to actually restore and heal the planet and thereby help ourselves. As we know, Pushpam, I know, talked a lot about the actual value of ecosystems and the services that they produce. As we learn, as we understand that, and we put those into economic models, as we put those into development strategies, because we understand the difference between the short-term versus long-term costs of cutting down a forest, then we'll start to make decisions that make more sense. So I'm very hopeful for that.
That's fantastic. That was what I needed to hear. Thank you. We really appreciate you being here. We appreciate all the work you're doing with UNEP at COP28 specifically, and so grateful for you joining us today, in spite of the time difference, technical challenges, and all of those things. We want to give special thanks to your colleague, Michael Alexander, for his support on your side. Have a great conference. Everybody, can we give a round of applause loud enough that Susan can hear it in Dubai? And we look forward to catching up with you on your return. That's a cool room.
Yeah, we'll show you a little bit. This is the conference. You can see it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. And so everybody's going to be coming in great spirits and ready to get to work.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thanks again.
Thank you.
So now we're going to pivot rapidly from Dubai back here to DC. I have the pleasure to introduce to you Rachel McCave, Senior Associate for Youth Engagement of the United Nations Association of the United States of America, UNAUSA. UNAUSA is about to release its American Youth Priorities Report, which was gathered during a listening tour with the UNAUSA Youth Observer. Hopefully we can glean a few highlights. Good afternoon, Rachel. So glad you could participate today. What can you tell us about today's youth and what they value with what we can glean from the report? What are the priorities that the youth have? What are their concerns?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to speak with all of you today and share a little bit about the youth perspective. I do have a presentation with some data that I'd like to share if I'm able to pull that up. Perfect. So before I get into some of my findings and talking points, I actually have a short video that I'd like to share with everyone, and I believe the team has that ready on cue.
Young people are a huge part in progress and innovation in society. Is because
throughout history, the youth has always been the forefront of changing the landscape, merging cultures.
In order to create something that the world has never seen before.
We have to stress that youth get involved with all these policy making, make things more accommodating for them in the future, instead of copying the same thing that's been going on in history over and over again. Sustainable development goals for me is all about manifesting more inclusive, diverse people to come in and say what they think solutions to be for, such as quality education and climate change.
We just need everyone from a young age to even older ages to understand what it is and how it's going to impact the world to be a lot better than it is now.
To reduce inequalities, it should be based on the merit of the person themselves, because you don't know what you're going to get from someone just because of how they look. You only find out once you find out.
We have come a long way. I feel as though at the same time we contradict ourselves, because if a female and a male have the same knowledge and at hand, they should get paid the same.
As the technology develops, we make sure that people don't get left behind. We all have equal opportunities, and we can all make a difference for the future.
Equal is just equal. In my mind, it's just those two dashes on top of each other. I don't think it should have such a complex definition. It's a universal definition. Equal is equal. 1 equals 1.
All right, next slide, please. Next slide. So before I dive into some youth insights, I just wanted to share a little bit more about UNA USA as an organization. So we are part of the UN Foundation, and we're considered one of the largest grassroots movements of Americans in support of the United Nations. So we have about 20,000 members, but interestingly, about 60% of our membership base is actually under the age of 26. So it really is, a largely youth-led movement that we're very excited to share. So we organize ourselves in about over 200 chapters across the US. We have both community chapters, which are based in cities, and then we have campus chapters based at colleges and universities. And overall, we advocate for strong US leadership at the UN, and we encourage our members to advocate for the Sustainable Development Goals and issues that the UN advocates for, but on a local level. So one thing that we like to say is think globally and act locally. So a lot of our, efforts as an organization is encouraging our members to think about the world and think about the SDGs as a framework, but then to look into the local communities and think about what they can do on the ground. So just to provide, 2 quick examples of some interesting work that's being done by our chapters as it relates to sustainability. One project is called Vision New Jersey 2030, and that is all about introducing the SDGs as a framework within the state of New Jersey, particularly Hoboken, Jersey City, and Northern New Jersey. And this project actually collaborated with graduate students who are kind of reporting out on how the SDGs are being implemented on a local level. And then a lot of that information is sort of shared with stakeholders as they're, continuing to do community work and figuring out how to make those particular parts of New Jersey more sustainable. And then another interesting project is, over on the West Coast in the Rocky Mountains region, they really focused on SDG 4, which is quality education. And they actually did work to expand broadband internet access to rural and indigenous communities in the Rocky Mountains region in order to help with accessing, more information and kind of providing access to quality education through the expansion of broadband internet. So our chapters are always doing really great work on a local level, and we support them in that. Particularly using the SDGs as a really helpful framework. Next slide, please. Next slide. So shifting gears and talking about young people and youth, we have what's called a Youth Observer to the United Nations. So every year they embark on a listening tour where they go around the United States and they meet with thousands of American youth. And essentially they hear from youth, what issues do they care about? How are they implementing the SDGs in their communities? What do young people want to see when it comes to youth engagement, particularly with the United Nations? So after this listening tour, they compile what's called the American Youth Priorities Report. And today I'm going to share just some, key findings that we found both last year and this year as well. Next slide. So some of the major kind of takeaways as it relates to what youth are kind of looking for and hoping for when it comes to engaging with them is intersectionality. And I believe I heard that term being used a bit earlier today as well. But, the overall sentiment is that you can't kind of address one SDG or one issue without kind of addressing other issues. And so when we've heard from young people, they often talk about wanting to sort of de-silo a lot of the advocacy work and kind of work together in addressing, both climate change, but also, migration, and also if you're addressing poverty, also addressing housing and food insecurity. So working more together to kind of think about these issues holistically and how they relate to each other. Another key finding is young people are looking for meaningful participation in decision-making processes. So, a lot of times with large entities who are wanting to engage with youth, sometimes there's a little bit of tokenism. Young people are invited to maybe sit in on a meeting or maybe speak for a couple of minutes, but they're not really, participating fully in decision-making processes. So young people are really looking for more of a seat at the table when it comes to, addressing global issues and taking action. Another interesting theme that stood out to us was a need for intergenerational movement building. So UNA USA, we welcome members of all ages. And even though we have so many youth members, young people want to work with older generations because although they are inheriting, a lot of these societal issues and in this world, older generations are still here and there's a lot to learn from them. And so young people are looking for that guidance and mentorship from those advocates who've done the work before them. And then another key finding that we found was an emphasis on equity. So reducing inequalities and looking at social injustice, that needs to be a key part of, addressing sustainability and how we're thinking about creating a more sustainable world. Next slide, please. So from 2022, we found that these were kind of the main SDGs that young people were really focused on and cared the most about during this listening tour. So this was in meetings and surveys and conversations between young Americans and our youth observer to the UN. So even within these, different SDGs, as I alluded to earlier, kind of the intersectionality, they said, while I care about, SDG 1, I also care about all of these other SDGs, but some interesting findings related to these were a lot of young people referenced the COVID-19 pandemic having a huge impact on worsening, poverty in their local communities, but then thinking about how poverty also relates to food and housing insecurity. And then, for example, with good health and well-being, advocating for mental health is a huge issue that we're seeing amongst young people in our community. But related to health, young people are also advocating for affordable healthcare and access to healthcare. Not only women's access to healthcare as it pertains to reproductive rights, which was another big topic that came up, but also access for the LGBTQIA+ community in regards to healthcare. And so those are some of the standouts as it relates to health. Regarding quality education and gender equality, one thing that was interesting was a lot of young people were mentioning a need for more young women and girls in STEM education. And so a lot of them expressed, there's still discriminatory practices happening in educational spaces that serve as barriers to entry for a lot of young women and young girls, particularly around STEM education. And then also related to education, especially after the COVID pandemic with things moving online and digital education, increasing access to the internet to make education more accessible and equitable was another big theme. And then, of course, with climate action, this is, a very important topic for our young members and the American youth that we've been in conversation with. And one big theme was sort of related to environmental racism and then environmental justice, especially for vulnerable groups and marginalized populations. So relating this to, reduced inequalities and thinking about social justice and human rights for all people, environmental racism and justice was a big standout as it relates to climate action and SDG 13. And what I will also say is, during these listening tours, when our youth observer is meeting with American youth and asking them these different questions about how they want to be more involved with the work of the UN and the SDGs, it's important to note that young people are already doing the work. A lot of them have their own organizations. A lot of them have their own projects. They're looking to expand that. They're looking for resources. They're looking for funding. They're looking for networks. They're looking for mentors. And so it's important to raise that young people are already doing the work and that they need support in the work that they're doing. And when it relates to the SDGs in particular, I think introducing young people to the framework of the SDGs is really important because it helps them think critically about the issues in their own communities and how that relates to the work that's being done on a national level, but also on a global level with the UN and the global community. Next slide, please. And next slide. Okay, so just before I close, I wanted to kind of talk about what's happening this year with our current youth observer. That person is Ose Oregon. They are currently on the 2023 listening tour. So they've been traveling across the US and meeting with more American youth. And, a lot of themes from last year are also kind of spilling over into this year. But because this is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been kind of a huge focus for young people and young Americans in our work this year. Especially human rights for all people. So thinking about that intersectionality and thinking about kind of, solving social injustices as we think about creating a more sustainable world. And I will also say, generally young people are very eager to be a part of organizations and companies that are honestly and earnestly working to create a more sustainable and just world. And they're looking for ways to be involved that elevate youth voices and elevate the work of youth people or of young people, excuse me. So I think it's important to, to note that they need to be empowered as leaders of not just tomorrow, not just of the future, but also of today. So with that, thank you so much for your time. I left my contact information if you'd like me to share, this year's report, or if you want to talk about, youth engagement at UNA USA.
That's so great. Yeah, I'm sure there are some people in the room here and watching virtually who would be interested to see that full report. I'm very interested to hear about youth that are doing this work in their own organizations already, and maybe brainstorming with some of the folks in here as to how we get groups like that to join UIS and start to connect them to credit unions and see what we can do for those sorts of organizations. Thank you so much, Rachel. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.